The Game Awards are this week, and while I do have some opinions about award shows in general, I can't lie, there is a fun element to looking at everything that is nominated and taking your best guess at who's actually going to win. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing in this video. I'm going to take a look at a whole bunch of categories that I feel at least educated enough on to talk about. Have I played every single game that came out this year? Absolutely not, but I've played a bunch of them and have done my best to keep on top of general opinions, vibes, reviews, reception, all that kind of good stuff. So the categories where I feel pretty good about knowing the landscape, I'm gonna lay out some predictions. The first one we're gonna talk about is most anticipated game because, well, none of these games have actually been released yet. Now, it's a pretty diverse lineup in terms of very different styles of games. Metroid Prime 4, Ghost of Yotei, Death Stranding 2, and my first instinct would be to say that in terms of just general overall hype for next year, Monster Hunter Wilds would be the one to look at, but it's gonna be Grand Theft Auto 6. I mean, look, GTA, Rockstar Games in general, is just one of those brands where when they release something, it is a major, discussed, talked about, excited title for the given year it's released in. It's just always going to be something that is center stage when it releases, and I just don't see anything else here winning most anticipated. I'm personally more excited about some of the other games on this list, like Metroid Prime 4 and Ghost of Yotei, but can't deny the name power that is Rockstar. Best Sim Strategy Game. Now, I'll admit that this is one that I actually don't feel super confident in, but I wanted to touch on it because this really, I think, highlights how interesting it can be when you have genre breakdowns and how extremely different each individual game can be. All of these games certainly count as strategy. You've got way more zoomed out stuff like Manor Lords and Age of Mythology going up against stuff like Kunitsugami, which is really kind of an action tower defense hybrid, which, yeah, there's strategy, but it's a very different kind of game, as well as Unicorn Overlord. Now, me personally, Unicorn Overlord is the one that I like the most. That was a game I'm a huge fan of and is really the main reason I wanted to shout out this category. I don't think it's going to be the one to take the award, only because historically, when it comes to the Game Awards and the panels that are voting on this stuff, JRPGs have a bit of an uphill battle. Not that they can't win, but it really takes a breakout hit, I think, to push through, which we do have a couple this year, but I don't think Unicorn Overlord is going to be the one to do it. This is one of the ones where I don't feel that confident in which one's going to take it. I know Age of Mythology is a legacy title where there is some energy going behind it that some people might be voting for, but I haven't studied enough on things like Frostpunk and Manor Lords where maybe one of those could end up being a, well, at least to me, a surprise. Best Family Game. This one's kind of a weird one to me because in my head, I understand the concept of a game being family friendly, which a lot of the games on this list are, but when I think of just generally the concept of a family game, I think of something that a family can play together, which only one game on this list is actually focused on, which is Mario Party Jamboree. And by that logic alone, I feel like that should win, but it's going up against some very heavy hitter single player games that are generally all ages family friendly. Stuff like Astro Bot, Legend of Zelda, Plucky Squire. I feel like if voting is purely based on just the merits of each of these games individually, it's probably going to be Astro Bot. I mean, out of all the games on this particular list, that is also up for Game of the Year, which tends to be a bit of a sign of how much people liked it, but I feel like depending on how people vote, Mario Party could end up pushing through only because, again, that's actually one that involves the whole family playing together, even though Mario Party is absolutely the kind of multiplayer that destroys more relationships than it actually helps build. Best Fighting Game. This is one that's a little close in my mind, and it really comes down to 3 of the 5 games that I think have a stronger shot. Tekken 8, because it just feels like one of the very strong pillar titles as far as a major fighting game that we got a new mainline entry in. Dragon Ball, because it's Dragon Ball, that is a massive IP, not to mention this particular game is bringing back the style of Budokai and Tenkaichi games, which were very much beloved, so it was fantastic to see that style make a comeback this year. And then one that feels a little bit like cheating to me because it's not really like a heavy remake or anything, but it is a collection of some truly fantastic games, the Marvel vs. Capcom collection, which, you know, the big shining point there is Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is now much more accessible on modern hardware. The legacy name power of that game alone, I feel like, could end up carrying it to being the #1 here. But if people decide to focus on, you know, truly brand new releases that came out this year, I want to give it to Tekken 8. I feel like there is going to be some energy going behind Dragon Ball, but if I had to pick one of these as the winner, I think Tekken 8's the one that's going to end up doing it. Best role-playing game. Now, this is a category that is very near and dear to my heart, and this has been an excellent year for the genre. So much so that, honestly, I'm actually kind of surprised which games ended up on this list. Most of them are solid. I do enjoy Dragon's Dogma 2, but there was so many other amazing RPGs this year. I'm kind of surprised that was one of the ones to break in. But the rest of it, though, very strong stuff, especially evident by the fact that 3 of these 5 games are also up for Game of the Year: Shadow of Erdtree, Metaphor ReFantazio, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And you could argue that depending on which of those games wins this category might just be the tip-off of what game ends up taking Game of the Year this year. But depending on how people vote, I could see this concept of voting which is the best RPG in the sense of being an RPG, and another game maybe losing this category, but then taking Game of the Year later because of, the full package of what that game is. And so with that in mind, I'd love to see Metaphor take the win here. I think in terms of just something that captures a more classical RPG style approach, as well as pushing the genre in some slightly different directions, adapting the Persona style gameplay into a fantasy game. I think this is just, honestly, as far as the pure definition of a traditional role-playing game goes, is my personal favorite this year. I think there's a very solid chance it goes to Erdtree or Rebirth instead, and really, if I had to bet, I'm leaning towards Rebirth actually winning here, but I would love to see Metaphor be the one to take the win. Best Action Adventure Game. This is another category where we have a pretty broad list of games that are very different styles. And action adventure in general is kind of a vague term, and I sometimes wonder if they should just drop the action word here because there's even a separate category called Best Action Game. And it's really just which game out of this list captures the sense of adventure the strongest. And we have some very different titles going on, with some more family-friendly games like Astro Bot and Legend of Zelda going up against Prince of Persia, Silent Hill 2, and Star Wars Outlaws, which none of these games are really remotely the same style of game. Now again, if you want to go with the logic of the fact that one of these is up for Game of the Year, that's a pretty strong sign for Astro Bot to take the win. But again, I think if people focus more on just how well a game accomplishes the specific goal of adventure, I think Silent Hill 2 actually has a very strong chance here, especially because this is a game where I think there were some extra waves made a little bit this year, because there was a lot of doubt whether or not Bloober Team could really pull off remaking a game that has the kind of name power and legacy and history that Silent Hill 2 has, and they absolutely nailed making something that stayed true to a lot of the source material, but ended up still feeling like a bit of its own new game. And while it is a very specific form of adventure as far as just journeying into the deeply messed up world of Silent Hill, it nails that feeling, and I feel like it could win. Best Action Game. This is one that I'm not super confident in because there are some games on this list that I have played and very thoroughly enjoyed, and other ones that are just really kind of out of my personal wheelhouse, and so focusing on how other people have reacted to them, I feel like there's a lot of energy going on for them for stuff like Helldivers 2, for instance. Personally, out of what's on this list, as far as just pure action goes, I feel like Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is the one I'd give it to. There's just something about the level of how powerful you feel in that game and being able to take down hordes of enemies that is just so incredibly satisfying. Stellar Blade made a very strong impression on me this year as well, and if it wasn't for Warhammer, I would probably be giving it to that as far as just games I've personally enjoyed. But in terms of what's going to actually take the win for action game, the vibes to me are Helldivers 2 or Space Marine 2. Also Black Myth Wukong, which is up for Game of the Year, but that's another title where I think that's a situation of, are we focusing specifically on action gameplay or what the total package is? Best Debut Indie Game. Now, this is one where I've played most of the games on this list, and when it comes down to the one that I think has the juice to win it, look, Balatro is up for Game of the Year. So that immediately gives it a very clear favorite sign to go ahead and just take this category as well. I think Animal Well would be another excellent title to see win, and it also made its own fantastic splash and debut, but Balatra's up for Game of the Year for a reason, and that game is one of those titles that just had such an impact, grew such a huge audience so quickly for great reason. It's probably going to be the one to take this category. Which, while we're at it, Best Independent Game, Balatra's up for there as well, and using that same logic, it's probably going to win there as well. Personally, I understand the love of Balatro, but as far as the games on independent game list goes, my personal favorite that I would love to see take the win here, UFO 50. Such an incredibly well-executed idea of being a collection of 50 full-fledged retro-style games, not mini games, not micro games, but actual full-fledged games that feel like they would have released in the 80s. But even this kind of background story baked into the whole thing of seeing how these games developed over time. And the thing is too, it's not just this awesome concept of, you know, there being these 50 different games, they're also just really, really good games. UFO 50 is honestly just one of my favorite titles this year, period. And while I think Balatro is going to end up taking the win because, again, it's also up for Game of the Year, I would love to be surprised and see UFO 50 take it instead. Best audio design. Now, I have played all the games on this list except for Call of Duty, so that could end up being a surprise one. As far as the other four go, I feel like it's going to end up being between Silent Hill 2 and Hellblade. Well, I think the other nominees are incredible games in general. As far as just specifically sound design, well, they did a good job of that. It's kind of the job of horror or very heavy suspense games like Hellblade to lean into sound design as being a core part of design. And that is one of the things about Hellblade is that while, you know, I think in terms of being an overall game, there are a lot of very different mixed opinions about it, but as far as being a very large, fancy tech demo and showing off some excellent production values, it knocks it out of the park, and that sound design is part of that aspect. That said, Silent Hill 2, though, I think also really drives this concept home well and builds up a great sense of atmosphere, especially if you play that game with headphones on. I mean, that's really true of both of them. I feel like Hellblade 2 is going to take it, but I would not be mad at all to see it go to Silent Hill 2. Best score and music. All 5 games in this category have incredible soundtracks. Personally, though, I think the one that's going to take it, and it's the one that I would love to see win it, Metaphor. I mean, just the main combat theme alone is so damn good. Not to say that there isn't great music in the other ones either, but as far as I think something that has built up its own unique identity and maybe also plays against type a little bit in terms of what game scoring should sound like, it is such a damn good soundtrack that captures the vibes of that game perfectly. If something were to beat out Metaphor in this category, it's probably Rebirth, which is, you know, a heavy theme going across a lot of categories here. I would not be mad if Rebirth took the win, but especially for this specific category, I feel like it should go to Metaphor. Both incredible soundtracks, but one of them has to win it. Best art direction. Another strong lineup going on in this one. I feel like the lead two, in my mind, for this are either Black Myth Wukong or Metaphor ReFantazio again, particularly when it comes down to just character designs. I mean, you look at the monstrous humans in Metaphor and how they capture these stylings of Hieronymus Bosch paintings, just such a unique approach and something that I think is burned in a lot of people's brains immediately upon seeing them. Fantastic designs. Black Myth Wukong, by a similar token, while not quite as strange in their approach, also just has some wonderful looking character designs that I think really stand out and is one of the strong points of that game. I will say that in my mind, this category is a little bit of a tighter run. You know, I think Erdtree has a lot of momentum behind it because art direction has been traditionally a very strong point for FromSoft games, particularly all the Soul-style ones as far as the environmental designs and some enemy designs. I think because that is something that is a little more established, though, and that we've seen a little more often, that does take a little bit of air out of the tires compared to stuff like Metaphor and Wukong. And by similar token, Astro Bot, also incredible world designs of a very different style than everything else, being much more family-friendly in its approach. I feel like that is one that could win, but I want to give a little bit more energy towards Metaphor and Wukong on this one. Best narrative. This is another one where we have a very familiar lineup of some major games, a couple of which I think, again, are kind of the strong leaders in this particular segment. Metaphor and Rebirth are just popping up in every category they can. I think it's going to be a battle that's carried out all the way to Game of the Year. And I think, again, both of those have a strong shot at winning Best Narrative. I love me some Like a Dragon, but Infinite Wealth, I have some misgivings with the plot, and that is a sentiment I've seen shared with a few other people, and so I think that is going to get some votes. I don't think it's going to end up taking the win here. And Silent Hill 2 is an interesting situation because, well, yes, Silent Hill 2 is an incredible narrative. It is a remake that is working with something that was an incredible narrative in the first place when it came out the first time around, which there's a whole debate that can be asked about whether or not that disqualifies it from winning this year. Clearly, at least made it to the nomination list, but I do think that's an internal debate that could impact how some people choose to vote for this category, giving a few more votes to the other ones. This is another one where it feels pretty tight overall. Again, I'm going to echo a thought that I've had for a couple categories. I feel like it should go to Metaphor, but I would not be shocked if Rebirth took it instead. Which leads us to two final categories I want to talk about at the same time, because I feel like they are two that are very similar but don't always end up having the same winner: Best Game Direction and Game of the Year. There's, I think, this kind of immediate knee-jerk when you hear Best Game Direction, you would think, well, whatever wins that is also going to win Game of the Year, which has not been the case. I mean, if you just look at the last 4 years alone, we actually have two examples where, yes, the same game won both, and then two examples where different games won. For instance, Baldur's Gate 3 took Game of the Year last year, but Best Game Direction went to Alan Wake 2. And I think part of this comes down to the fact of how big of a personality the director of a game is, can play a little bit of a role, how much people are aware of who is leading direction. But also I think there is a debate for the concept of, one game is just a better overall game, but there is a specific vision that is trying to be captured in another title that, for better or worse, did what it was trying to do, and thus takes the win there, even if the other game is overall a larger standout release. And when looking at this year in particular, for direction specifically, I would love to see Metaphor take the win here. Again, while it is something that is fairly traditional, there's a lot of very interesting mix-ups and changes and new approach to this game that I absolutely love and I think should be rewarded, but they may or may not be the case. For Game of the Year itself, just as far as all-around winner, while Metaphor and Rebirth have come up very consistently in multiple categories, and I do think they both have a shot at it, and if it was between the two of them, I actually do think Rebirth has the stronger chance for a couple different reasons. It is impossible not to recognize the threat that comes from Shadow of Erdtree, because Elden Ring itself won Game of the Year back when it came out in 2022, and Erdtree, while being DLC, is effectively kind of just a built-in Elden Ring 2. We've already seen all kinds of debates and discourse over whether or not DLC like this should really count for Game of the Year. The point is, it is up for the running, it did get nominated, and there are going to be people who vote for it. And just because of the strong momentum that FromSoft has had with some of their games, I feel like that has a very realistic chance of winning. If it were me personally, clearly based on how I've been talking about a lot of other categories, I think Metaphor is my personal winner. I don't see it taking the actual official Game of the Year win, though. If I had to bet on one of these, as much as it's going to cause some fun conversations after, I think Erdtree's got a pretty strong shot here. I would love to see it be something else on this list, especially because we have some very interesting titles that I think are a great break from what has been a bit of the status quo game-wise. Astro Bot I think is a wonderful new showcase of a 3D platformer that, not to say we haven't had any great 3D platformers in the last decade, it certainly has not been as huge of a genre as some of these others. And just the concept of an indie game like Balatro taking it, I think would be fantastic, although that would also lead to its own fun conversations. But just going off of what has won Game of the Year in the past and the kind of general hype cycle that tends to lead to that, Erdtree's feeling pretty strong here. So there's just a bunch of categories for the Game Awards that I want to talk about where, stuff I love that I would love to see win and what I think is going to actually take it. Again, I have not played absolutely everything that has come out this year. I haven't finished every single game either that I've been talking about that I've been playing. So, absolutely could be wrong on some of these. Probably am going to be wrong on quite a few of them. I'm curious how close I am on some of them, though. Let me know down below in the comments. What stuff do you want to see win? Is there any particular category where there's a game that you really think deserves it that you want to see take the win this year? Let me know down below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you all later.